Today we face a very serious multidimensional crisis. This crisis affects all spheres of life. In other words, it is an economic crisis, it is a political crisis, it is a social crisis, an ecological crisis, even a cultural crisis. So uh, the question is there any common thread? That is, can we find any common cause for the various aspects of the crisis? And the answer to my mind is yes. The cause is always the concentration of power at various levels. It is the concentration of economic power which leads to the economic crisis, of political power which leads to the political crisis, and so on. Political crisis is a byproduct of the dynamic of representative democracy. Representative democracy is not a system that was always there. It was created almost about the same time as the system of the market economy 200 years ago, and its dynamic has led to the present situation where it's not even parliaments anymore that take important decisions. It's not even the governing parties, but it is just cliques around the president or the prime minister which take all important decisions. This creates huge alienation. That's why today we don't have any more mass political parties. People do not become members of parties as used to be the case in the past. Not only this, today many people do not even bother to vote. So this is a manifestation of the huge political crisis that the system of representative democracy is going through at the moment. Therefore, if you look at every aspect of the present crisis, you will see that the ultimate cause behind it is the concentration of power in some form. And that's why we need an inclusive democracy, because an inclusive democracy is the abolition of this concentration of power at the institutional level, the abolition of this concentration of power in all its forms, and the creation of conditions of equal sharing of power, of political, economic power, and so on. I'm Takis Fotopoulos. I'm a writer and editor of the international journal Democracy and Nature, the International Journal for Inclusive Democracy. And I have been teaching economics at the University of North London in the past for over 20 years. I would like to talk about the project of inclusive democracy. And I would like to start first with what is inclusive democracy. I think it is important to stress that the inclusive democracy project is not just an economic model, but it is a broader political project which aims to remake society at all levels, at the political level, the economic level, the social level, and of course in the ecological sphere. The overall aim of the inclusive democracy project is to create a society in which people determine themselves, in which, in other words, the demos, as it was the classical concept for the people, the demos has overall control over the political sphere, the economic sphere, the social sphere in general. So the inclusive democracy project, in a sense, is a synthesis of the two major traditions, the two major historical traditions, the socialist tradition and the democratic tradition, and also of the currents that developed in the last 30 or 40 years, the new social movements, the feminist movement, the ecological movement, the identity movements of various sorts, and so on. In other words, the inclusive democracy project is a synthesis of all those historical experiences uh, of the socialist and also of the democratic tradition and all those new social movements. And in this sense, we can say that the inclusive democracy project is neither a theoretical construct, but it is the product of all those historical experiences, nor it is a utopia. And it is not a utopia because there are already trends all around us leading to a society which, in various aspects, resembles the inclusive democracy society. Uh, there are all over experiments going on with alternative institutions, and whenever there is an insurrection, like for example the recent Argentinian one, we have seen people organizing themselves in general assemblies and trying to organize political and economic life according to principles like the principles that I'm going to explain in a moment are the principles of the inclusive democracy project. The four components of the inclusive democracy society are first the what we may call political or direct democracy, second economic democracy, third democracy at a social level, and fourth ecological democracy. So let's see briefly what we mean by each of those components. Political or direct democracy means the authority of demos, of people, over the political sphere. In other words, political democracy implies that it is people collectively that take decisions about all political affairs and directly without representatives, because what we call today representative democracy is a fake democracy, since there can be no representation of my will or nobody's will. That is, you can either express your will directly or you can simply delegate a certain kind of wish of you, but you cannot have somebody else decide for you. So political or direct democracy is the type of society where people directly and collectively decide for themselves on all important aspects of political life. Uh, that means that in a direct democracy, every resident in a particular area uh, takes part in the democratic process. Uh, we shall assume that usually this could not be a community of more than 30 to 50,000 people. In the same way as we define political democracy as the authority of demos over the political sphere, we can define economic democracy as the authority of demos over the economic sphere. This means that it is uh, the citizen body, that is all people at mature age, which is decided by the assemblies, all people at a certain age decide all major economic, take decisions on all major economic problems, particularly those affecting the meeting of basic needs. In an inclusive democracy, there should be no private ownership of productive resources, of the means of production, but instead the productive resources should be owned by the demos. There should be demotic ownership of the means of production. The third component of inclusive democracy is democracy at a social level. That means at the micro level, at the level of the workplace, the household, the educational place, and so on. In all those places, there should be democracy in the sense that there should be equal distribution of power. There should be no distinction, in other words, between workers working in a workplace. There should be no distinction. There should be, in other words, equal distribution of power between men and women. There should be equal distribution of power between teachers and students or pupils and so on. And finally, we have the fourth component of inclusive democracy, the ecological democracy component, which means that the inclusive democracy aims to create the subjective and objective conditions so that man is reintegrated into nature, society is reintegrated into nature. This is important because what we have today is a kind of situation where society is separate from nature. We see nature as an instrument to achieve certain objectives. The main objective is economic growth, of course, and as a result we suffer the crisis that we have at the moment, the serious ecological crisis. So having seen what is an inclusive democracy and why we need an inclusive democracy, the next important thing is to see how an economic democracy, that is, how this basic component of inclusive democracy will work, what sort of institutions we can imagine that would secure equal distribution of economic power. This is important not in order to prescribe some kind of regime that should follow in the future. This is silly because in fact it is the democratic assemblies of the future that will decide the form that their institution will take. What we can only do here is to give an idea of why such a system is feasible, how it can work, and make some proposals that would implement all the basic principles I mentioned before. The model, therefore, of economic democracy that I'm going to explain in a moment represents also a synthesis, as the whole project of inclusive democracy represents a synthesis of two systems that we have known in the past, the planning system on the one hand and the market system that we still have. The basic element of the planning system, or the basic aim, if you like, of the planning system was that it aimed at securing the meeting of basic needs of our people. On the other hand, the basic element that is produced or presented by supporters of the market system as its main strong point is freedom of choice. However, neither of the two systems has worked as in theory. That is, the planning system, the central planning system in the East, has created some conditions so that the basic need, more or less, of all people have been met. But this did not mean any kind of economic democracy because, as I said before, the decisions were taken by the political elite. Nor the market system does satisfy the supposed advantage of freedom of choice, because it's ridiculous to talk about freedom of choice when basic needs have not been met. So the question is how we can have a system that on the one hand secures the satisfaction of all basic needs of all citizens, and on the other hand secures freedom of choice. For this, the proposal of the Inclusive Democracy Project is to combine the planning element, which would be especially useful as regards the meeting of basic needs, with the market element, not in the sense of a real market like the present one, but in the sense of an artificial market, and I'm going to explain it in a moment. As you can see in this simple diagram, At the bottom of the image you can see citizens decide, and there you can see that it is citizens who decide production, decide consumption, decide work. In other words, all important decisions are being taken by citizens. This is not accidental, because you should not forget that this is a model of the economy which is stateless. In other words, it does not presuppose a state. It's moneyless in the sense that it does not presuppose money in the sense that we know it today. And it is marketless in the sense that there is no real market but an artificial market, and it is basically citizens who decide. So let's move first to the consumption side of the economy. And there you can see that citizens decide as consumers how to allocate their income, which income comes in the form of vouchers. That is, citizens, in exchange for the work they offer to the society, they are rewarded with vouchers. Now, we may distinguish here between basic and non-basic vouchers. Let's start with basic vouchers on the right. We can estimate the number of man hours that people have to offer to society, to the community, so that the basic needs are satisfied. The planners, in other words, on the basis of estimates about what are basic needs, and what are basic needs is decided democratically, not objectively, because if you introduce the element of objectivity, then you may easily end up with all sorts of arbitrary decisions. So democratically, citizens decide which needs are basic, and also which should be the level of satisfaction. What should be the level of satisfaction so that a basic need, say food or clothing or whatever, is satisfied. So, on the basis of the size of the population, estimates about the size of the population, and the entitlement of each citizen to a particular basic need, on the one hand, and on the other hand, on the basis of technological averages, we can find out what is the total number of basic hours that should be offered in a community of, say, 30 or 50,000 people, so that its basic needs are satisfied. The non-basic vouchers are issued to citizens who would like to work over and above the minimum requirement that is needed for the satisfaction of basic needs. Let's say that planners have estimated that everybody has to work 3 hours a day so that all basic needs are met. Then if somebody wants to work more than 3 hours, either in the same line of activity or a different one, then is rewarded for this with non-basic vouchers which can use in buying goods and services which are of non-basic nature. The question that arises with respect to non-basic vouchers is how we can determine the rate of exchange. In other words, the prices, in quotation marks, at which work is exchanged with non-basic vouchers. For basic vouchers there is no problem, because everybody has to work a minimum number of hours to meet his or her basic needs. But with non-basic vouchers there is a question of what is the rate of remuneration. Now, here we can take into account, and that's why I talked before about an artificial market, we can take into account the demand and supply conditions of the past. In other words, if, say, a mobile is characterized as a non-basic good by the assemblies, and if, say, over the past 6 months in this community there has been an offer of, say, 100,000 non-basic vouchers in the purchase of mobiles, and with these 100,000 vouchers people could buy 1,000 mobiles, because that was the total production of mobiles, Then, if we divide over the number of vouchers used in the purchase of mobiles over the number of mobiles produced, we get 100. So the price of a mobile is 100 non-basic vouchers. And similarly, we can find out the price of any other non-basic good. In other words, by taking into account what production took place over a period of time, and take into account also what the demand for this particular type of good and service was. This way, therefore, we start with actual demand and actual supply conditions rather than, and this is a major drawback of most planning systems, rather than by asking in advance people what they wish to buy and then calculate accordingly through the planning mechanism what to be produced. The disadvantage of all these types of planning is that people have to decide 6 months or a year in advance what exactly they're going to buy, which of course is something that seriously restricts freedom of choice. So let's move now to the production side of the economy. As you can see, citizens decide the production targets in demotic assemblies on the one hand and workplace assemblies on the other. Now, demotic assemblies are the most important, perhaps, body of decision making in the inclusive democracy. It is the assembly of the demos, the assembly of the citizen body in a particular area. A demotic assembly takes decisions on all aspects of economic and political and social life, and as regards economics in particular, it decides on the basis of the plan which is designed at a confederal level, as I'm going to see in a moment. The demotic assembly, on the basis of the confederal plan instructions, which, as we have seen before, estimates what the basic needs would be of the people and how many hours each has to work. So on the basis of these instructions, the demotic assembly give instructions to the workplace assembly, the various workplaces and the workplace assemblies, of what the work tasks are, that is, what they have to produce in order to meet the needs of the people. However, both demotic and workplace assemblies refer to the local level. We have, however, to think that there are also problems of regional or even national or even continental significance and so on. That's why we need also what we may call regional assemblies, as you can see in the diagram, which decide on problems that cannot be decided at a local level, because in principle all main decisions are taken at a local level, but there are problems which cannot be solved at a local level. Take transport, take energy, take communication. You cannot solve these sort of problems at a local level, so there should be a regional assembly consisting of delegates from the demotic assemblies that not takes decisions. That's important. The regional assembly is administrative council. It's not a policy-taking, policy-making body. You remember, we have delegates. We don't have representatives. So from demotic assemblies, a number of delegates are elected to the regional assembly in order to implement the decisions of the demotic assemblies. Finally, we have confederal assemblies, which are the highest organ of the economic organ of the inclusive democracy, and which means that an inclusive democracy cannot work only at the local level. Unless local democracies are confederated in a kind of a confederal inclusive democracy, then it is meaningless to talk about any reasonable allocation of resources. In fact, I could say that the three conditions of economic democracy are first what I mentioned before, the democratic ownership of the means of production. Second, it's self-reliance, that is, each local community, each local demos should be self-reliant, not in the sense of autarky. Autarky is impossible today, but in the sense of relying on its own resources in order to meet as many needs as possible. And the third important principle that is implied by this economic democracy model is confederal allocation of resources. The allocation of resources takes place at the confederal level. In a free society, the question is who is going to do the unpleasant jobs, and how we can meet demand and supply when, say, many more people would like to do jobs that are very pleasant and so on, versus the other type of job. Now, one solution that is being suggested is the idea of job complexes, which means that people can do a variety of work tasks. In other words, we can expand the meaning of the job or type of job to include as many as possible work tasks. For example, if you work in an office, you can do typing, but at the same time you can be involved in other types of more interesting work in the office and in decision taking as well, and so on. So in this sense, the job complex idea does sort out the problem of how we choose jobs in certain kinds of activity. But this is not a panacea again. That is, there are types of activity that we can think of where the idea of job complexes may not work, especially when you need a very high degree of training and skill in order to do a particular job. I cannot think of a job complex for a surgeon, say, or for a pilot. I cannot think of the surgeon doing also the cleaning or whatever, or helping the nurse doing injections, because that would be a waste of his time and of society's time, even more important. So there should be some other way of expressing the desires of people and as regards the type of work they choose. As regards the non-basic type of work, there is a system that is proposed by the inclusive democracy system that could sort out this problem. But as regards the basic type of work, I think the only solution, if at the end there is a serious mismatch between demand and supply, is either rotation, that is, people do various types of activities on rotation, so that who is going to do hard works like building or mining, then again you can have some rotation, that's one way. Or another way may be that you reward people doing jobs for which there is not much demand with non-basic vouchers on top of the basic vouchers they have to receive anyway. If we move up to the diagram, then we can see that we have on the left the index of desirability, and on the other the prices of non-basic goods and services. These are the two basic elements could determine the rate of remuneration of non-basic work. Why? The index of desirability is a complex index showing the desires of people as regards various types of work. First, as regards the index of desirability, we can design it as an inverse function of desirability, in the sense that the more desirable a type of work is, a type of job is, the less the remuneration is. So that in this sense we can have on the one hand satisfaction of the desire of people, and on the other hand satisfaction of the needs of society, in the sense that for non-desirable works there should be higher remuneration. Say a builder or a miner should receive a higher remuneration than perhaps a university teacher, because the university teacher gets more satisfaction from his work than a miner or a builder. Furthermore, and that's important, we have an adjustment mechanism here at work, because if, say, in a particular type of activity there is not much offer for non-basic work. If, say, there are not many people who would like to do extra work in the production of mobiles again, then that means that this would be reflected in the price of mobile. The price of mobile will go up as production of mobile would fall. Therefore, as the price of mobile will go up, the rate of remuneration will go up, and this could attract more workers in the production of mobiles. So that's, in a nutshell, how this model of economic democracy works. But as I said from the beginning, this is just a proposal to show that it is feasible to have a different kind of society, meeting the basic needs of all citizens and at the same time meeting the demand for freedom of choice. And it is, of course, up to the General Assemblies of the future to decide what exactly the form of their society should be. Finally, the question, which is of course a crucial question that we have to consider, is how we move towards an inclusive democracy. That is, how we envisage a transitional strategy towards this sort of society. I think that the basic principle that should guide our steps is that means should be consistent with ends. Therefore, we need a new type of political organization that would secure the meeting of the basic demands of direct democracy. Therefore, that rules out any kind of avant-garde and hierarchical political parties and so on. And what we need instead is a new movement, a new kind of mass movement that would be based on autonomous, more or less, organizations that could be confederated, of course, that would start building institutions of inclusive democracy in their own areas. In other words, I can see the transition towards an inclusive democracy using two sorts of tactics, or if you like, strategies. On the one hand, the usual defensive strategy of the left, which means taking part in struggles of the working class, of people in general, against the attacks of neoliberal globalization. But this is only one part of the struggle, as far as I can see it. The other equally important, if not even more important, part of the struggle is the positive one, is the one involving building alternative institutions within the present society. In fact, this process has already started. That is, you can see all over the place co-ops being established by various groups, communes and so on. The LETS schemes in Anglo-Saxon countries whereby unemployed people particularly avoid the use of money and can exchange directly their services with other services. So there are all sorts of schemes going on, similar schemes going on at the moment. The problem is that all those schemes are not part of a comprehensive political program for political change. For this, I would have no hesitation, even if these groups, these teams of people who have started installing these alternative institutions take part in local elections. In other words, if they take part in local elections in the sense of including the democracy program, or generally a program for a comprehensive type of democracy. Uh, and this presupposes that it has become already massive in the sense that the movement has already a significant appeal to the people. Then if they win the local elections, they have a perfect opportunity to apply, to implement at the local level the principles of inclusive democracy. In other words, they will take local power in order to abolish it, if you like, the next day, in the sense that once they take local power, they take over local power, then from the next day on they will start organizing people in neighborhood assemblies to take over instead of the usual council, the usual municipalist council and so on. The importance of the transitional strategy of the inclusive democracy project is that the new society would not be established at all unless the majority of the population has already subscribed to this project, unless, in other words, they have already adopted, using the institutions in practice, using the institutions, the alternative institutions in practice, and getting the democratic consciousness, unless the majority has already been persuaded in a new society of this type, the society will not come about. When the moment comes that the power from below, this power that has started from below, is more powerful than the power of the normal authorities, in other words, capitalist, the state, and so on, then after a period of tension between the state and the capitalist elite on the one hand, and the people self-organized in this way on the other, then you could expect that you could have a transition which may or may not be violent. That is, it would be violent, of course, if the elites, as it is possible, uh, attack these sort of experiments using various forms of force, and force may not be physical force, even economic force may sometimes be enough. Uh, but it may not be violent. That is, it all depends, of course, on the balance of power at the moment of the transition.